Thank you so much, Emily, for that warm introduction, and thanks all of you for coming. It's great to see a full lecture hall here, and multi-generational too. And thanks so much, St. Francis College, for including me in this wonderful series, Crimcasts, that you do here. It's critically important that we look at our criminal justice system and the horrible mess it's become. As probably all of you are sick and tired of hearing, because it's true, we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. And how can we be a really free country when we lock so many people up? I think it pays sometimes to kind of hit the ideological mute button when you look at different countries and tune out the rhetoric and tune out, the self-image that each country has, and just look at how many people are getting locked up in jail. And that just says so much. The racial disparity is horrendous, you know that. I want to point out that that's only the beginning of the problem. The incarceration rate for white people is still about 6 times higher than it is in Germany. It would be seen as astronomically high in itself in other industrialized nations. Whereas the incarceration rate for black Americans in particular, it's higher than the incarceration rate for black people in South Africa at the height of apartheid, and higher, significantly higher, than the incarceration rate in the peak Gulag USSR. And fixing that is going to be a generational effort. It's going to require a lot of local battles at the county level, the state level, and to a much lesser degree at the federal level. And it's great to see both the young and the non-young in this room, because, to repeat, it's going to be a generational effort. And I hope the young and the less young will be chatting with each other after this lecture and after other lectures, because there's a lot of shared wisdom and fresh perspectives that can be shared in order to further this goal, to humanize our criminal justice system and to bring us out of this barbaric system that we've built for ourselves. Now, I'm going to be talking about something different today, a very particular, somewhat exotic case of criminal injustice, the case of Chelsea Manning. But first, I just want to drop a little piece of folk wisdom, a great American folk saying that I love. It's frequently misattributed to Mark Twain, and sometimes attributed without that much foundation either to the great American writer Ambrose Bierce. And that's this line: "War is God's way of teaching Americans geography." Do you understand that? War is God's way of teaching Americans geography. We're blocked in by 2 giant oceans. We've got one large, not particularly mighty neighbor to the north and also to the south. And we're a big country, but we're kind of isolated from the rest of the world just by geography. We don't face threats from either of the 2 countries that border us, and we tend to be very ignorant about the rest of the world. And it's only when we have a foreign war that we learn about such places as Vietnam, Laos, the Dominican Republic, that's looking back in American history. I don't know if any of you saw this story in the Washington Post. It came out just after Labor Day. Turns out on Labor Day weekend, the United States was busy bombing 6 countries. And this wasn't alarming headlines. This was kind of a think piece that came up, on Tuesday. This was not, front of the page, top of the page, stop the presses stuff. This is something that has become disturbingly normal, that we're in a permanent state of war, permanent state of semi-war, although there's nothing semi about these wars to the people in these countries. Just wondering to ask maybe the young people first. I'm going to pick on you first before I get to the less young. Can you name these 6 countries? It's okay if you can't. Syria is one. I want to hear the youngs. What are some other countries that the U.S. has been busy bombing? Afghanistan? How about one in North Africa. It started with the U.S. military intervention. That's a euphemism for war in 2011. Libya. Okay, so that's, we've got 3. 4, we got Afghanistan. There are 2 more, one in the Horn of Africa, Somalia, and one more in the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen. There's been a drone campaign against Yemen for much of the Obama presidency.
Because ISIS is there? Yeah.
No, not ISIS, but a group that we have considered to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, the Arabian Peninsula, ACAP, they're technically called. So that's 6 countries. Now, it used to be that war taught Americans geography, but given that we have an all-volunteer army now, there's no draft, let alone mandatory military service, war in these countries is just out of sight, out of mind. I mean, unless someone in your family has voluntarily enlisted, your family doesn't have any direct skin in the game. And it's become even more attenuated than that now that we have these things called unmanned aerial vehicles, commonly known as drones. I think the Onion magazine called them aerial death robots, which might be the most accurate way to put it. But we are ever further removed from the wars that our country is waging. And even here in a university, with multi-generational audiences, it takes a little while to come up with a complete list of all the countries that we are bombing. And I don't mean to pick on you guys. The New York Review of Books just had an article about 6 weeks ago by a renowned legal scholar who's writing about the faulty legal procedure of our drone assassinations. That, you know, drone assassinations are fine, but we need better legal procedure, was kind of his point. And even he missed one of the countries that the U.S. has been droning under the Obama administration, and none of the editors caught it. And that's the New York Review of Books, the quality media. This is David Cole's article, and he leaves out the Philippines. So that's the context that we're in. There's a lot of ignorance about the wars we're fighting. And I'm saying this not to, berate you or to scold you. This is very widespread in our country. And moreover, this ignorance, I don't think it's necessarily a kind of empty space, like a vacant lot that's primed for development, where people want to know, they want knowledge built up there. Very often, ignorance is not just empty space, but it's kind of a solid, dense object, maybe surrounded by barbed wire. And I think often you can compare ignorance to a comforting fleece blanket. I mean, people really are comforted by ignorance. We don't want to know very often the bad things that our country is doing because we want to feel good about our country. That's very human. It's very tribal. And, we're still a very tribal country, like most countries in the world. But woe betide the person who would take away this ignorance. And woe betide the person who would dare to take our comforting fleece blanket away. And that is why Private Chelsea Manning is rotting in a military prison right now. Private Chelsea Manning is a soldier in the Iraq War, who dared to get the truth out about the Iraq War, about the Afghan War, and about U.S. foreign policy in general. And that has to be punished. Who is Chelsea Manning? Let me backtrack a little bit. Chelsea Manning begins life as Bradley Manning, born in 1987, one of us millennials. Born in Crescent, Oklahoma, precocious child. Both of Bradley Manning's parents are each in their own way wrecks, alcoholic wrecks. And poor young Manning learns very quickly to take care of the family, is writing the utility checks at a very young age because his parents aren't doing that, and is very much on his own. Very good with computers, very good at science, really interested in that, very bright person. But when high school finishes, in-state tuition in Oklahoma is too high, and there's no support from parents for going to school. So young Manning bums around for a bit, takes various odd jobs, was homeless for a while, living out of a truck in the O'Hare Airport parking lot in Chicago, and then does what a lot of young people do who are at loose ends, who are interested in the world and want to see the world, feel some kind of obligation to their society, to their country, and want to give something back. And young Manning joins the U.S. Army in 2007. And this is at a time when it's already clear that the invasion of Iraq, launched by Bush and Cheney, is going horribly wrong, that it was a mistake, and recruiting numbers are at record lows. It's very hard to get people to sign up for a war that is going very wrong. But Chelsea Manning, then known as Bradley, is good with computers. They need those skills, even though not really a typical soldier, not what you think of stereotypically as real Army material. Young Manning is gay. 5'2", and not the kind of 5'2" person who will take your head off if you mess with him. But signs up anyway. Has a pretty tough time of basic training. But this soldier makes his way through the military, gets recruited by Army intelligence because of the great skills with IT that he has, and winds up deployed to Iraq at a desolate deployment in the middle of the Madar Desert between Baghdad and the Iran border, called Forward Operating Base Hammer, where he is very busy doing Army intel work in a supposedly secure digital facility called a SCIF, a secure compartmentalized intelligence facility. And it's there, when fully exposed to all the horrors of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And young Private Manning really did think Operation Iraqi Freedom was going to be about Iraqi freedom. That this young soldier begins questioning the war. This young soldier sees that a group of Iraqi civilians who he was in charge of investigating because they were arrested by the local Iraqi authorities and thrown into prison were in fact just handing out a pamphlet protesting corruption in the Iraqi government. The pamphlet is called "Where Does the Money Go?" And there's a lot of money disappearing. Everything's in chaos. There's essentially a civil war going on, an insurgency, and a military occupation all at once. And young Private Manning is worried about these people. Private Manning knows that the Iraqi authorities are still practicing torture, even though the US government, including the top military leader, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is saying, no, we do not tolerate torture. We do not let that happen in the Iraq that we're occupying. But that's not the truth. And the young soldier knows this. And despite the young private's protests, nothing is done to help these people who are arrested. The young private also sees terrifying footage of a U.S. military helicopter shot from the vantage point of the helicopter, gunning down a crowd of civilians in 2007. This is a famous video now. You can find it online easily. I highly recommend watching it, even though it's tough stuff. It's called Collateral Murder. It's the name of the video. And that video is one of the very first things that Private Manning leaked to Wikileaks. This is how Private Manning decides to respond to the Iraq War and the horrors that he is witnessing, believing accurately that people at home in the United States are not getting an accurate picture of the war. Private Manning decides to leak not just the video, but a great many other military documents and old field reports to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, as you may know, it's a non-governmental organization To the extent they have a base now, they're kind of all over, but they're in London for a while. It's an international crew, and they're dedicated to exposing important secret information. Sometimes it's frivolous stuff, sometimes it's important stuff, like records about the war in Iraq, records about the war in Afghanistan that people they think should know about. So what Chelsea Manning passes on are 90,000 field logs from the Afghan war, which is still ongoing, 392,000 field logs from the Iraq war. And both of these provide a kind of mosaic picture of how these wars are going, which is not very well. It's all through individual field reports. So you read about checkpoint shootings of civilians, you read about night raids gone wrong, you read about outposts built in the far deep interior of Afghanistan and then abandoned. This is what a counterinsurgency campaign looks like. Not all of it, is exhibits of atrocity or horrors, but all of it's important to see and know about, especially as in 2009 and in 2010, our country is weighing whether or not we should escalate the war in Afghanistan or begin to get out. And the choice that President Obama made was to escalate and to send 30,000 more troops there. And in fact, most of the US casualties and Afghan casualties of that long war have happened under President Obama's watch. So aside from these field logs of the ongoing Afghan war and the Iraq war, young Private Manning also leaks files on the Guantanamo prisoners and about 250,000 diplomatic cables from the State Department, where you really see the day-to-day workings of US statecraft around the world. You learn things that the US is lobbying hard to keep down the minimum wage in Haiti, the poorest country in our hemisphere. You learn that the US is lobbying hard to make prescription drugs as expensive, essentially, as possible in Western Europe, so American drug companies can reap a good profit. None of this is illegal. All of this falls within the bounds of law, but many people think that this isn't the way foreign policy should be conducted. None of the files that Private Manning leaks is top secret. Exactly zero. And in fact, nearly half of the files aren't classified at all. But even though they weren't classified, the government didn't particularly feel like making them available to the public either. And the most famous of these files, the helicopter video that I was telling you about, was not classified in any way. And again, I highly recommend taking just a few minutes to watch that. It doesn't tell the whole story of the Iraq War, of course, but it does tell you an important part of the story. Now, leaking all of this information out of this forward operating base in Iraq to WikiLeaks, you might think that must have been extremely difficult. In fact, like most of the big security breaches in US history, it was quite easy to do. It really was not that much security to speak of. There were writable CD-ROM drives attached to the computers. That's a big no-no. People were writing their passwords, people with security clearance, on little, Post-it notes, sticking it. It was easy to get in and out. And young Private Manning famously brought out a lot of these documents on a CD-ROM that the soldier labeled Lady Gaga, then sent it to WikiLeaks from a more or less public computer at a Barnes & Noble in Maryland while at home on leave. And the reaction to these leaks from the US government is somewhat ballistic. This, again, is in spite of the fact that absolutely nothing is top secret. There's no nuclear launch codes. The field logs are all from events that have, to be obvious, have already happened. We're not talking about, ongoing troop movements or anything like that. But the US government, which has been more than a little bit reckless in sending our military to fight these wars at great cost in blood, the blood of our own soldiers and certainly the blood of foreign peoples, suddenly gets very prim and concerned about the threat to foreign lives and the cost to our security. Even though there's been a great deal of silence about the lives lost of foreign people, now there's a gusher of concern about the hypothetical lives that might have been lost thanks to these leaks. There's a great deal of embarrassment. And for instance, Admiral Mike Mullen, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, offered that WikiLeaks might already have on their hands the blood of some young soldier or that of an Afghan family. This is after he himself pushed hard for President Obama to escalate the war in Afghanistan, a choice that has not resulted in any strategic or humanitarian gains for that country. Hillary Clinton, then the Secretary of State, calls Manning leaks an attack on the international community that, quote, puts people's lives in danger and threatens our national security. Bear in mind, this is someone who supported the Iraq invasion, someone who supported the Libya war. Libya is now an oasis for the Islamic State, something that would not have happened otherwise but for the US military intervention. But she is suddenly condemning WikiLeaks for putting people at risk and doing harm to national security. I leave it to you to judge whether this is hypocritical, whether this is crocodile tears, whether this show of sudden conscience and morality is anything other than for show. Chelsea Manning herself gets busted. She gets busted because she opens up in online chat sessions at the very end of her military tour of duty while still deployed in Afghanistan with a fairly famous hacker named Adrian Lamo. And Chelsea Manning can't hold back and can't resist confiding in the hacking and the leaking that she's done. And little does she know that Adrian Lamo is a federal informant. And so Chelsea Manning is arrested in Iraq, gets put in punitive isolation on a suicide watch for 2 months in Kuwait before being sent to back home to Quantico, a Marine Corps base in Virginia, for 9 more months of punitive isolation. Now, the government's line is that this punitive isolation, being stripped naked except for a plastic apron, not being allowed any books or pens or anything, being allowed only 1 hour of exercise a day, is for the soldier's own good. President Obama assures the media that this is, well, really for the soldier's own good. We know now, as a matter of fact, that Quantico's own physician was recommending urgently that this be stopped, that there is no longer any suicide risk, and that this is an incredibly harsh way to treat someone who's not a risk to himself, not a risk to others. It becomes a bit of an international incident. The UN Special Rapporteur for Torture, Juan Mendez, deems that this is cruel and inhumane treatment. That's just one notch below torture. There are between 70 and 100,000 people being held in isolation, prisoners in America today. So the practice of locking someone up even before their trial in isolation is not unheard of. And I don't mean to say that Chelsea Manning's case is unique or some kind of, one-off aberration of American values. It would be nice if that were the case, but in fact that's the kind of brutality that's fairly widespread. But this does become an international incident. And it's also very much the way other countries have treated whistleblowers and leakers. Whenever you have a highly visible and prominent dissident who's leaking information, whether in the US or the Soviet Union, usually the government's first line is to attack their sanity. In the old Soviet Union, what was done is political dissidents were often declared insane. I mean, why else would anyone defy the government, and put in special psychological prisons called the psikushkas, where they had a kind of punitive therapy. That's very similar to what was done to young Private Manning. It's very similar to what the government tried to do to Daniel Ellsberg a generation earlier. Some of the non-young people I see nodding their heads. One of the first things the Nixon administration did was to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to look for dirt on him so they could declare him crazy. Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers all about the Vietnam War. This was the greatest US military and humanitarian disaster before the Iraq War, and I think still is more of a disaster in magnitude and lives lost than the Iraq War. But that's how governments frequently respond to political dissidents like Private Manning. You declare them crazy, you attack their insanity, you lock them in punitive confinement and tell the world that it's really for their own good. I don't mean to pick on President Obama completely. He's done some things that I think are very good in office, but I do think that President Obama's defense of this treatment is not one of the high points of his presidency. So what does it mean, these leaks? The press was very ambivalent and had kind of a schizoid reaction to them. On the one hand, major media news outlets were very happy to run story after story after story based on the trove of new information. And it's good that they did. We need to know how our wars are going. It's true that not everyone is paying attention, but that doesn't mean that they're not happening. And it's true that awful things are happening. That's just in the nature of war. No matter how many lawyers you get involved to choose the targets, you are still going to have civilians getting killed. You're still going to have accidents. You're going to have a lot of carnage when you're dealing with weaponry, no matter how supposedly precise it is. And we know that, and we have a much clearer picture of that now. We have a clearer picture of American statecraft and foreign policy through the leaked State Department cables, too. You didn't have any kind of crash in American diplomacy. It's not as if foreign policy froze up. And in a way, many of the things that were revealed were open secrets, things that people suspected, kind of knew about already, but now had proof. And this great wealth of information is very steadily entering the scholarly bloodstream. And it's very important for how we understand ourselves and our own recent history. I know not everyone wants to do that, but I think people of wisdom with some sense want to understand who we are and what we have been doing. And sometimes those are good things, sometimes those are not so good things. But we have this knowledge. The leaks of Chelsea Manning forced a real conversation also about the nature of secrecy and who has access to secrets. Why are so many things secret? The United States classifies millions of things every year. And even though Chelsea Manning's leak is the largest in US history, what the young soldier leaked is less than 1% of what the US classifies in any given year. Less than 1%. And even though the quality liberal press like the New Yorker and sometimes the New York Times scowled and furrowed their brows about how awful this is, there's going to be a slippery slope of declassification that will paralyze government, and soon there will just be something called total transparency. Of course, that hasn't happened. In fact, the volume of classification and overclassification has adjusted a little bit, but not very much. I would caution all of you, both the old and the young in this room, beware of slippery slope arguments. You're going to hear a lot of bad ones in your life. That if we start declassifying through some leaker less than 1% of what Washington classifies every year, soon government will cease to function. That's really not how things work, usually. Usually things are not a slippery slope. And this also brought to light the interesting fact of just how many security clearances there are. Anyone care to guess how many security clearances there are in the world? Security clearance is the special access, right of access you have as a government worker or a government contractor who's not officially paid by the government. There are over 1 million top secret security clearances. That's the populations of North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming altogether. That's more than the population of Washington, D.C. I just want to point this out too, again, I'm repeating, nothing that Chelsea Manning leaked, by the way, was top secret. None of it. Nobody wants nuclear launch codes floating around. That's not really an issue. And yet the reaction to Chelsea Manning's leaks from our quality intellectuals in the New Yorker and the New Republic and other was stern lectures about how soon we'll have nuclear launch codes floating around, while there was often a singular lack of engagement from the real risks and the real problems that we have in our ongoing wars that many, especially in the media, especially in government, would much rather people didn't pay attention to. That's the story of Chelsea Manning, but only part of it. Manning was court-martialed and convicted of 10 run-of-the-mill crimes, misuse of government computers, abusing access, and to one big crime, and that was violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. This is not a very good law that was passed in the heat of World War I, where there was war fever, war panic in this country, a lot of anti-German freaking out. And it was not meant as an official secrets act that would punish domestic whistleblowers, but it was used as such first by President Nixon, who retooled it to throw at Daniel Ellsberg. And rather disappointingly, it's something that President Obama has thrown at 8 domestic leakers and whistleblowers. And Chelsea Manning is one of them. The sentence that Chelsea Manning received was for 35 years. And that's rather harsh. But then we tend to sentence people very harshly in this country. So that's where we are now in an ongoing story about Chelsea Manning. The story is not over. I hope I haven't confused you too much by referring her to Bradley. The name of my book, I'll be selling a few copies afterwards, is The Passion of Bradley Manning. But right after her conviction and her sentencing, which is after my book came out, she announced that she came out as transgender, something that you could tell from the chat logs between her and the government informant was in the works, and is now Chelsea Manning. And one thing she's doing as a prisoner of the US military is fighting hard for the dignity and rights of transgender prisoners, fighting hard to be put not in a men's prison, but in a women's military prison. Right now she's in a men's prison. Fighting hard for the right to grow her hair and to get hormone therapy and a gender transition procedure. And she's been successful. She went on hunger strike, and this was after attempted self-harm in July. But the hunger strike and the pressure brought by her very skilled lawyer from the ACLU, someone named Chase Strangio, has succeeded just recently in pushing the military to change its policy and to view gender dysphoria like any other illness, something that can and should be treated. We do and we should treat prisoners with illnesses, whether it's heart disease or diabetes or anything else, and gender dysphoria should fall into that category too. So she's continuing to push hard for justice with some success, and that's a good thing. And there's also some possibility, I think, that she may get clemency, a pardon or a commutation before her 35 years are up. She's 6 years into the sentence now, because it was 6 years ago that she was apprehended. Just yesterday, the center-right blog called Lawfare, very establishment, a very orthodox view on national security, I usually don't agree with it, but it's a discussion at a high level, made the argument that Chelsea Manning should get a commutation, that she has done enough time, that her 35-year sentence was outrageously harsh. They didn't go so far as to say her leaks have social value. I think their social value is immense because we need to know what our government is doing, whether we like what the government is doing or not. But they did show sympathy and think that she does deserve some mercy. And interestingly, this was compared in the same piece to an argument for no clemency for Edward Snowden. People usually are often like one or the other. They were saying Edward Snowden has not turned himself in. He has not faced the music for what he did. He should get no pardon. Chelsea Manning, on the other hand, should. I disagree with the second part of that. I think clemency is long overdue. And I give President Obama a lot of credit for the clemency that he is bestowing on a great many federal prisoners, not national security prisoners like Chelsea Manning, but mostly nonviolent drug offenders, where he has granted commutations to hundreds and hundreds of prisoners. And I hope there are hundreds more to come in the few months left of his office. But the whole push for Chelsea Manning, sorry, I didn't mean to be so emphatic into the mic there. The whole push for clemency for Chelsea Manning is not just about Chelsea Manning, it's a push for greater openness and transparency in our government. And I'm going to repeat this again because I find that I have to repeat this or people pretend they don't hear me. No one is asking for total transparency. Nobody is asking for the government to make everything instantly available. Nobody wants nuclear launch codes floating around, and occasionally the government has a good reason to keep something secret. But those who would insist that Manning and Wikileaks are some kind of threat to government, I think, are looking at our secrecy landscape through the wrong end of the telescope. We don't have radical utopians threatening to paralyze government. I think Private Manning is best seen as a very practical reformer fighting a dystopian system. We have dystopian levels of secrecy in this country, and we need a change to overclassification. We don't need millions of things and hundreds of thousands of things classified every year. We need just a few things that are absolutely necessary. We need expanded and accelerated declassification. Do you know how slow declassification is in this country of important security documents? It moves in a kind of geological tempo. Measured sometimes, let me put it this way. It was not until 2010 that one document from the presidency of James Madison was declassified. Literally 2 centuries. Should we be measuring declassification in centuries? It's ridiculous. And those who are eager to assert a risk to our security from information getting out, I think really need to look harder at the actual steps that our government is taking. You know, it's sending young people to fight in Iraq, in Afghanistan, our country's longest war, and now bombing Libya, now bombing many other. This is where blood and money gets lost. It's not people finding out about it because someone leaks old field reports. You know, we tend to blame everything about our wars on everything except the war themselves. Kind of reminds me of this one great Onion story about the college sophomore who blames his horrific hangover on not eating enough the night before, not drinking enough water, not taking aspirin when he woke up, everything except for the 7 or 8 beers that he drank. I think it's time to be a little more honest and face what the real costs of our foreign policy are, especially the costs of secrecy. In the tabulation and the reckoning of the costs of openness and information and knowledge versus the costs of secrecy, it is the blood price of secrecy and government distortion and occasional lies that has been consistently downplayed by elites in our media and in our government. I hope this doesn't sound, radical or revolutionary, but generally, if you're going to make an important decision, say buying a car, buying or renting an apartment, it's really good if you have all the relevant information. You don't look shocked. Guess what? The same thing goes for invading foreign sovereign nations. And government secrecy, distortion, and lies was a major factor in making the invasion of Iraq possible, that disaster. Government secrecy, distortion, and lies was a necessary cause for the invasion of South Vietnam a generation and a half earlier. There is an incredibly heavy price, usually paid in foreign blood, but also in American blood, by the government being dishonest and these dystopian levels of secrecy. Again, I propose Manning not as some utopian dreamer, but as a practical person with a practical solution. Now, I'm not saying that having all the information is going to magically cure and discipline our off-the-rails foreign policy. But I think we're going to have a much better chance of doing the right thing if there's public debate. As shocking as it may seem, sometimes political leaders and people in general really do change their minds based on having new information. I mean, I want to give one case in point about the Iraq War. Senator Bob Graham, a Democrat from Florida, was initially supportive of the Iraq invasion. But then he did his due diligence as a United States Senator and took the trouble to read the top secret classified national intelligence estimate on Iraq, the possibility of weapons of mass destruction there, and what that really means. He did his due diligence, read this classified report, and changed his mind and voted quite correctly, most people think now, against that invasion that has been such a disaster for now multiple countries. Sometimes, not all the time, having information out makes for a better decision. That's such a boring point, but I'm afraid it's one that has to be made again and again and again. And I'm going to say this for the last time. No one is calling for total transparency and everything to be out in the open. But right now, we have dystopian levels of secrecy, and it is deeply damaging our country. We need an end to overclassification. We need a new legal regime for dealing with leaks and whistleblowers, because we need a less punitive response to them. Right now, if a general is caught with some breach of information, there's no real response. But if a private or a junior intelligence person is, they get the book thrown at them. Their lives are ruined. We need to change it so that the government has to show concrete damage or a serious risk of harm, not just speculation, not just a gusher of concern over hypothetical lives lost, but a real possibility in order for them to be punished. We need all of these things not just out of goody two-shoes principle, but because they are practical. And we need a foreign policy that is much more practical and more disciplined than the shoot first, ask questions later approach that we continue to have, to a lesser degree under Obama than Bush and Cheney, to be sure, but we still have a long way to go. We also need clemency for Private Chelsea Manning. Thank you for listening. There are a lot of different pots. It's really under the executive branch, though. Okay. Intelligence agencies are under the executive branch. CIA, NSA, and the military is under executive authority. There is congressional oversight. Congress has really gone along, though, with believing in massive classification, punishment of leakers. It would be, a false hope to say, oh, if only we had more congressional involvement and oversight. That's not how it is. it's a bipartisan problem too. Like Democrats like Dianne Feinstein are as horrible as Republicans like John McCain. At the same time, you do have a kind of civil libertarian wing of both Democrats and Republicans who are also supporting Edward Snowden. It's something that splits both parties. And I personally am kind of excited about the prospect of civil libertarians of both parties uniting and working together to shrink the kind of senseless surveillance, dragnet surveillance of our everyday lives, and to tame that abuse of government power. Okay, the question is, would Private Manning's punishment be any different if some of these files had been top secret? I don't think so. I think it would have been even maybe a little more harsh, but probably not. I mean, the fact is that Private Manning had the opportunity to leak things that were top secret, but decided not to. Okay, the question is, if Manning had leaked things that were top secret, would I be sympathetic? Would I be advocating for Manning today? Would I think the punishment was... I don't think the meaningful criterion here is whether it's top secret or not. You have massive overclassification of what gets called top secret too. So many things that are top secret rightfully belong in the public domain, whether it's the Senate torture report, whether it's the National Intelligence Estimate on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that should have been instantly available. To me, the question is, can you prove that real harm was done? And, you know, it's important to realize just how reckless and overweening government classification is, even for the top secret level. And again, that's not an argument for total declassification, you know. Like most people, I'm fine with a little bit of government secrecy. It's just that it's become extreme and dystopian. Let me give you an example. The Pentagon Papers that Daniel Ellsberg leaked. This was a generation and a half ago. You can see a documentary movie about it. You know, it's really good. All of that was top secret. And yet people recognized that it was a good thing to know. It wasn't about ongoing things in Vietnam. He leaked it while Nixon was in power. And it was all about what President Kennedy and Johnson had done in Vietnam and their missteps, their lies to the public and to Congress. And it's vitally important that all of that top secret information got out. So the question is, what do I think of Hillary Clinton's private email server? So let me say a few things, because it's a little complicated. First of all, I think it's really bad what she did. You cannot be doing public business in the dark on your own private email when you're Secretary of State. That should be obvious. Public servants deserve and require public scrutiny and oversight, not just from Congress, but from the media and ordinary citizens. That's how our government works, and that's why our government works much better than more authoritarian governments. So I think it's horrible what she did. Now, that said, I think the problem, the harm that was done is not that there was some security breach, and it's not that vital information of national security somehow got out there. That's a really panicked overreaction, and I'm constantly disappointed in journalists who feel like they're little deputies of the national security state, who want to go scold government officials for not being tight-lipped enough. I mean, what is it with these journalists who defend government secrecy? I mean, that's professional malpractice right in itself. So I don't think that's the problem, and that's, although it's been hyped as one of the problems. I think the real problem is it is intrinsically wrong to be doing high-level state business on your own private email. I mean, historians and other people need to be able to look back. I take history very seriously, and I think we're a bit of an amnesiac country and society. That's a bad thing. I think journalists need to be able to get some access. And I hope that's making sense. I mean, and people who say, well, what about her privacy? When you're a public servant, an elite public servant at a cabinet level with that kind of power, you forfeit a lot of privacy. And if you do have private business with your family or personal life, that you do on your own email, and that's something people shouldn't have access to. Now, another thing, I do think this has to be kept in perspective, too. Because although I think it's a problem, I think that it's only one of many problems that both candidates have when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, there was recently some, who was it? There was some rather blow-dried airhead TV host, a guy, Matt Lauer. Matt Lauer interviewed both of them, of Trump and Clinton, about foreign policy, and 1/3 of the questions he asked Mandatars were all about the emails. And that's too much. And it's, I say that not so much to defend Hillary, but it has to be kept in perspective. The questions that you should be asking both of them is, what do you think about the military intervention that you, Secretary Clinton, supported and championed in Libya? Now, Trump, you've been lying through your teeth saying you were against it. In fact, we have recordings that say you supported it at the time. Ditto for the Iraq War. Those are important questions. So I think it's a problem, but I think it has to be kept in perspective. I certainly don't think it speaks well of her, that penchant for secrecy. And this idea that, oh, well, she deserves privacy. No. Chelsea Manning's leaks were through WikiLeaks, and they vetted some of them. And WikiLeaks is kind of the publisher, the conduit. Went through WikiLeaks to various newspapers, very establishment newspapers, whether it's The Guardian in the UK and the Daily Telegraph there, to the New York Times, the Washington Post. Snowden's leaks went through the Washington Post, through Barton Gellman, and also through Glenn Greenwald, who was working at the Guardian at the time. Snowden's leaks are different in character. They're mostly about the surveillance of Americans by the American government. Dragnet surveillance. That means the National Security Agency just vacuuming up everything and being able to access it. And also foreign leaders, too. And, the fact that the U.S. was tapping and had the ability to tap the president of Brazil's cell phone. This was very offensive to Brazilians. That the U.S. government was essentially spying on the German elite government. Germany, they have their own history of authoritarian government. I don't need to tell you about that. But they've reacted against that, to their credit. And I don't mean just the Nazis, but I also mean the former East Germany, where they spied on everyone. It was horrible. The reaction has been different. Americans don't like the idea of being spied on, for the most part. People have varying levels of tolerance for it, but there's been a much bigger angry reaction and mainstream sympathy for Snowden than for Manning. This is for many reasons. Part of it's the content of the leaks. Manning's leaks are showing things about our foreign policy, our ongoing wars, that are not very flattering to us. And people want to feel good about their country. People want to think that we're the best, we're the land of the free, we're only helping people. But this forces us to look at things that are not so pretty. And that gets less support. It really does. There's a response that has a difference in response that also has nothing to do with the leaks. Snowden is free, in exile, in a semi-authoritarian country in Russia, but is able to communicate and speak for himself very clearly. And he's a good speaker. He's very clear. It's very clear that what he did was out of principle. He got no financial gain. And he just believed, as a practical reformer, that you should not have this kind of senseless surveillance. Manning has been trapped and has not been able to communicate directly to the public. She's been writing some good news columns and opinion columns for The Guardian, which you can access online. It's a mainstream major British newspaper. The fact that Manning is transgender is something that gets her sympathy in some quarters, but also turns off a lot of other Americans, unfortunately. It makes her, perhaps in some ways, less of a poster child, although it also makes many people feel some empathy for her. Look at this person, fighting for LGBT rights in a terrible position, but still pushing. That's really great, and that's what I believe too. But there's that difference. There's a Hollywood movie directed by Oliver Stone that just came out about Snowden. I don't think we're going to see a big Hollywood movie about Manning soon. Although there has been some very good, some theatrical work about Manning. Because Manning's story, even though I presented it, I hope not too boring a way in kind of cost-benefit matter political science, it's a real morality play. And the play that won the top prize at the Edinburgh Theatre festival in the UK a few years ago was all about Chelsea Manning. The National Welsh Theatre Company, Manning's mother happens to be from Wales in the UK, did a great play about her. I've seen an avant-garde opera about her. So it's a great story. And it's an old story too, one of the oldest. The dilemma between the demands of personal morality and conscience and the demands of the law and the state. And this isn't something that decadent hippies invented. This goes all the way back to Antigone, 2,500 years ago with Sophocles. It's as old as civilization. And the struggle that we have with laws that are unjust is a running theme in American history, and it's a running theme in any society that has law. I think that there's really not much of a chance for a courtroom miracle here. There is a chance for parole, or the equivalent of parole in our military system. It's called good time served. And Manning would be eligible for that in just a few years. The problem is the military generally likes prisoners who don't make a fuss, who keep their heads down. And if you're pushing for transgender justice and criticizing the system, they're not going to like that. That's not being a model prisoner. But I think the best hope is just shifting what passes for common sense about secrecy in the United States. And that's what my role is, lecturing as often as I can to just get the word out that we have nothing to fear from greater knowledge about our foreign policy, and we have a lot to gain. Certainly the world does too. It's usually foreign peoples who pay the worst price for our foreign policy errors and acts of recklessness. But we do too. And that's the message that I'm trying to get out here today. The question is, are there parallels to ancient Rome when bread and circuses distracted the Roman plebs and kept them from involved? I think there's some of that true. We have advantages. We're much more of a middle-class society. There's mass literacy. But there's still too much. I just wish people were more politically engaged. And I say that not to blame entirely ordinary people. If you're working 2 jobs, if the education that you are given isn't especially great, it's tough to latch onto these things. They're a lot harder. One of the reasons I'd like to see a more social democratic America, a more middle-class society where people are working 35 hours a week instead of 55, is so that we can have more political engagement and more time for what your colleague behind you said. We need more public engagement and public discussion of these issues. So yeah, that's a common thread. I've looked at this very much from a distance, and I've been trying to tell the story with a wide-angle lens, with Manning as a figure in a landscape. And I certainly hope to have the chance to get, maybe some magazine will pay for me to go to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where she's imprisoned. I would love to meet her. But I'm still trying to get, this is a personal story, but it's also a very public story. There are important public themes: the Iraq War, how we treat information. We have very conflicting ideas about knowledge in our culture. In one perennial bestseller that a lot of you here at this Catholic college are familiar with, begins with a nice young couple evicted from their garden apartment because they gained forbidden knowledge. But then about 1,000 pages later, there's a nice punchline that the truth will set you free. I think we need more truth setting us free, and I think we should interpret that a bit literally. And the idea that we need that government secrecy will save us or protect us, we're kidding ourselves. Sometimes I'm pessimistic, but I think there's room for optimism and that public opinion is changing. I was just shocked to read these very right-wing orthodox security honchos, write on their lawfare blog that they think Manning should get a commutation. And I think that means that the common sense and the received wisdom is changing a little bit for Manning in a good direction. The Freedom of Information Act is simply a method to apply to declassify information. It doesn't provide any legal protection in a court of law for just leaking things yourself. I think we need an act like that would do such a thing, but the Freedom of Information Act provides no such mechanism. Okay, the question is how much attention has Private Manning's plea for clemency, a pardon, or a commutation received? Difference between a pardon and a commutation. Pardon is like you get your criminal record just wiped clean, like nothing ever happened. Commutation, you still have the conviction, but you're let out of prison. Okay, I think Manning and Snowden both deserve pardons. I'd settle for a commutation with Manning. I would like to see more attention. This isn't, there are a lot of important things going on in the world. I'm not going to tell you this is the number one thing, this is the number one prisoner. Our criminal justice system has thousands of people who are punished too harshly. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. There are, I think, tens of thousands of people who deserve clemency, and Chelsea Manning is one of them. I mean, the difference is what Chelsea Manning did is of great social value. I want more people to know about it, and not just for the sake of Chelsea Manning, one individual, but just to realize that this obsessive, extremist government secrecy is really bad for us and bad for other people. It deforms policy. Again, if you look at how badly our foreign policy elite screwed up with the invasion of Iraq, any private sector employee who did that would be fired on the spot. Now, we don't have the ability, unfortunately, to fire our complete foreign policy elite, but we can put them under increased supervision. And that's what Wikileaks is. That's what greater transparency is. Again, I mean, for the nth time, I'm not calling for total 100% transparency. That's not even really possible. But we need a much higher degree of practical transparency, and we need it badly.